I knew the HOA in this neighborhood was bad, but I didn't think they were this bad. It started when I was driving home from work one evening, minding my own business, when a woman stepped right into the middle of the street, holding up a clipboard like she was some kind of traffic cop. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, and rolled down my window. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with authority. "You're not allowed to drive through here." I blinked. What? "This road is for HOA members only," she declared, adjusting the obnoxiously large brooch on her blazer. "And you don't live here." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer stupidity of what she was saying. "This is a public road." She scoffed and crossed her arms. "Not anymore. We've decided to limit access to residents only. If you don't turn around, I'll have to report you to the authorities." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Lady, I do live here, right there." I pointed toward my house, not 50 feet away. Her eyes narrowed. "You're not a member of the HOA." "No," I said slowly, "because my house isn't part of your HOA. It never has been, and it never will be." That was a big issue with this neighborhood. The HOA had formed years after some of the houses were built, and those of us who had been here before weren't obligated to join. But that didn't stop them from trying to control us anyway. "Well," she huffed, "non-members don't get privileges." "Privileges?" I repeated, laughing in disbelief. "You mean using a public road?" She lifted her chin. "We maintain this road, we pay for it." "No, the city does," I shot back. "Which means it's public. You don't have any authority to stop people from driving here." She bristled. "We'll see about that," and with that she stormed off. I shook my head and pulled into my driveway, thinking that was the end of it. Oh, how wrong I was. The next morning I woke up to the sound of loud voices outside. I looked out the window and groaned. There she was again, standing in the middle of the street with two cops. I threw on some jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed my keys and headed outside. "What now?" I asked, exasperated. One of the officers, a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a complaint that you were trespassing on HOA property." I barked out a laugh. "Trespassing on a public road." The woman's face twisted into a smug expression. "You were warned," she said. "You refused to comply. This community has decided to restrict access, and you will respect that." I turned to the officers, trying to keep my cool. "This is a public road, you know that, right?" The second officer sighed. "Technically, yes, but she's claiming the HOA has an agreement with the city to enforce restrictions." I folded my arms. "Oh really? I'd love to see that agreement." The woman's confidence faltered for half a second before she recovered. "We don't have to show you anything." "That's what I thought," I said. "So unless you have some kind of actual legal reason to stop me, I'm going to keep using this road." The first officer looked at her. "Ma'am, if this is public property, we can't enforce any restrictions unless there's a legitimate city ordinance backing it up." She turned red. "Fine, then we'll take it further." I rolled my eyes. "Can't wait." I went back inside, thinking I'd shut her down for good. But that afternoon, I got a letter taped to my door. Notice of violation. It claimed I was illegally using HOA-maintained roads, and demanded that I cease immediately or face legal consequences. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the letter. This was beyond ridiculous. But then I noticed the last line. "Failure to comply will result in legal action, fines, and potential restrictions on your property access." Oh, now they were threatening my own property access. I cracked my knuckles, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number. "Hey Dad, I think you're gonna want to hear this." My father answered on the first ring, his voice calm as always. I laid out the entire situation in detail, making sure to include every absurd claim the HOA had thrown at me. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done, there was a long pause. Then he chuckled. "Oh, they really stepped in it this time." It wasn't just that my father was the mayor. He had been a city attorney before that, specializing in property law. If there was anyone who could dismantle this ridiculous power play, it was him. "I'm going to make a few calls," he said. "In the meantime, don't engage with them. Let them dig their hole a little deeper." I agreed and hung up, feeling a wave of satisfaction wash over me. These HOA clowns had no idea who they were messing with. By the next morning, I had half expected to see another letter, or worse, another attempt to block me from driving to my own home. But instead, things were strangely quiet. Too quiet. I spent the day waiting for something to happen, and just when I thought they might have backed down, I spotted a tow truck idling near the entrance of the neighborhood. Two HOA board members stood nearby, whispering to each other while occasionally glancing at my driveway. I stepped outside and leaned against my porch railing, making sure they knew I was watching. The tow truck driver, clearly just doing his job, looked uncomfortable as he received instructions from one of the board members. Then he started backing toward my driveway. I walked straight up to them and raised a hand. "Hey, what exactly do you think you're doing?" One of the board members, a wiry man with a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to his hand, adjusted his glasses and gave me a condescending look. "Your vehicle is being removed for violating HOA road restrictions. You were warned." I almost laughed. "You can't tow a car from private property." The tow truck driver hesitated, looking between me and them. "He's right," the driver muttered. "I need authorization to tow from a private driveway." The board member ignored him. "Your driveway is accessed via our roads. You've lost road privileges, which means you can't park there." I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to lose my temper. "This is illegal. If that truck touches my car, I'll sue every single person involved." The tow truck driver immediately threw up his hands and shook his head. "I'm not touching it, not without a court order." He climbed back into his truck, clearly wanting no part of this mess. The board members watched in frustration as he drove off. Then, the woman from before the one who had first tried to stop me on the road stepped forward. "Enjoy your little victory," she sneered. "This isn't over." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked back inside, already dialing my father again. That evening he showed up in person, a thick folder tucked under his arm. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I spoke to the city council and pulled the records on this street," he said. "They're lying about everything. The HOA doesn't maintain these roads, they have no jurisdiction over who drives on them, and they definitely can't restrict access to public property." I grinned. "So what do we do next?" "Simple," he said, flipping open the folder. "We make an example out of them." The next morning, my father arranged a meeting with the city's legal department and a few council members. He invited the HOA board under the guise of discussing community concerns. They walked in looking smug, probably thinking they had the upper hand. That changed the moment my father placed the legal documents in front of them. "This," he said, tapping the papers, "is the city's official record of road ownership and maintenance. It proves beyond any doubt that these are public roads, and that your HOA has no legal authority to restrict access, issue fines, or tow vehicles." The board members exchanged nervous glances. My father continued, "You've been harassing my son with false claims, attempting to enforce non-existent rules, and now attempting to steal his property by towing his car illegally. That's not just unethical, it's criminal." The woman who had confronted me before tried to recover. "We were acting in the best interest of the community." My father gave her a sharp look. "The community has no authority to override city regulations, and since you insisted on escalating this, I've spoken to the city attorney. If you don't immediately revoke all violation notices and issue a written apology, we'll be pursuing legal action against the HOA for fraud and harassment." The color drained from their faces. "You have until the end of the day to comply," he added. "Otherwise, this will be taken to court, and I assure you the city will not be on your side." The meeting ended in complete silence. By nightfall, a notice was sent to every homeowner stating that all road restrictions were null and void. The fines were dropped, and I received a formal apology, though I could tell it was written through gritted teeth. But the best part, the HOA president who had masterminded this entire scheme resigned the next week. Turns out, trying to illegally control public property was a bad look. And with that, the neighborhood was finally free from their nonsense. With the HOA president gone and their fraudulent road restrictions dismantled, I figured things would finally calm down. But I underestimated just how deep the rot went. The remaining board members were desperate to hold on to whatever power they had left, and they weren't about to let this defeat go so easily. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a shift in their tactics. They weren't overtly harassing me anymore, no more bogus violation notices or tow trucks lurking near my driveway. Instead, they had turned to something more insidious, trying to turn the neighborhood against me. It started with whispers. A few of my neighbors, ones who had been neutral before, started acting distant. Conversations that used to be friendly now ended with awkward silences. When I walked my dog, I caught people exchanging glances and muttering under their breath. I wasn't stupid, the HOA was spreading rumors. At first I ignored it, let them talk, but then I overheard something that made my blood boil. I was coming back from the grocery store when I passed by a group of longtime residents chatting near the mailboxes. They didn't see me at first. "He's just trying to stir up trouble," one woman said. "He thinks he's above the rules because of his father," another muttered. That did it. I stepped closer, making no effort to hide my presence. "Funny," I said, setting my bags down deliberately, "because the only people breaking rules are the HOA." They looked startled, but to their credit, they didn't scatter like cockroaches. The first woman crossed her arms. "We just don't understand why you're so against making the neighborhood better." "That's not what this was ever about," I said. My voice was calm, but I made sure they all knew I wasn't backing down. This was about them lying, about them trying to enforce rules they don't have the authority to enforce. One of the men scoffed. "You could have just gone along with it instead of making a scene." I stared at him. Gone along with what? Letting them illegally restrict public roads, fining people for things that aren't against the law, letting them tow my car from my own driveway. That last part seemed to make a few of them uneasy. They didn't know about that. I pressed on. They threatened me with legal action over something they had no control over. They lied to the police. They tried to steal my property, and when that failed, they started spreading lies about me. The first woman frowned. "What lies?" I folded my arms. "That I think I'm above the rules, that I'm trying to destroy the community, that my father only got involved to cover for me." The silence that followed was telling. Some of them had believed it, others hadn't been sure but had stayed quiet, and a few, I realized, had been waiting for someone to confront it head-on. One of the older men cleared his throat. "I didn't know about the towing thing." "Of course you didn't," I said, "because they didn't want you to." The mood shifted. The group wasn't outright siding with me yet, but I had planted enough doubt. That night I went inside and made a decision. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, I was going to take things up a notch. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence I had. Emails, notices, recordings of my interactions with them. My father had already done the heavy lifting with the legal side, but now I needed to make sure the community saw them for what they really were. Then I made my moves. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning at the community center. It wasn't technically open to non-members, but there was nothing stopping residents from standing outside. By the time the board members arrived, a sizable crowd had gathered, and I wasn't alone. Several neighbors who had been on the fence before were now standing with me. The board members looked uneasy as they walked inside, but they didn't say anything. Then I pulled out my phone and started playing one of the recordings, the conversation where they had tried to justify towing my car. People stopped and listened, some gasped, others muttered angrily. Then I played the recording of the woman claiming they had an agreement with the city to restrict the roads. By the time I was done, the crowd had doubled. Then the doors to the community center opened, and the board members stepped outside. They had no choice. The meeting had been derailed before it even started. The woman who had started this whole mess tried to salvage the situation. "This is highly inappropriate," she said. "If you have a complaint, there are proper channels." "Like lying to the police," someone in the crowd shot back. "Or trying to steal someone's car," another added. The board looked rattled. I stepped forward. "You've spent weeks trying to turn the community against me, but the truth is out, and now everyone sees you for what you are." The murmurs of agreement were getting louder. Then someone shouted from the back, "We need a vote." That was all it took. Within minutes, people were demanding a recall. The board members tried to push back, claiming it wasn't the right time, that there were procedures, but no one was listening. The crowd had turned against them completely. By the end of the day, 3 of the remaining board members had resigned. The rest were given notice that a vote would be held to remove them. And just like that, the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was shattered. A week later, a new board was elected, one that actually cared about the community instead of power. And as for me, I kept walking my dog with my head held high, knowing that when you stand your ground, justice has a way of catching up. With the HOA's leadership gutted and the remaining board members scrambling to save face, the neighborhood was finally starting to settle down. But there was still unfinished business. The people who had been wronged by the HOA over the years hadn't forgotten, and now that the fear of retaliation was gone, they were ready to make things right. One of my neighbors, an older man named Frank, had lived in the community longer than anyone. He was one of the few who had never been intimidated by the HOA's bullying, but even he had suffered under their mismanagement. He was waiting on my porch one afternoon when I got home. He wasted no time getting to the point. "We need to go after the money." I nodded. I figured that was coming. The HOA had been collecting dues for years, and while some of that money had gone toward maintenance, a lot of it had disappeared into thin air. The former president and her inner circle had controlled the finances without oversight, and now that they were gone, people wanted answers. Frank had already done some digging. He handed me a folder filled with financial statements. Most of them were vague, with large sums labeled under generic terms like community improvements and administrative costs. But there were inconsistencies, payments made to businesses that didn't exist, withdrawals that didn't match any known expenses. "This is embezzlement," I said. Frank nodded, and we're going to make sure they pay for it. We took the documents to my father, who wasted no time getting the city involved. Within days, an official audit was launched. The remaining board members, desperate to avoid legal trouble, started turning on each other. They claimed they hadn't known what was going on, that they had just followed orders, but the paper trail told a different story. The worst offender was the former president. She had been funneling money into a personal account, using HOA funds to pay for vacations, luxury goods, and even personal legal fees from previous disputes. When confronted with the evidence, she tried to claim it was all a mistake, that she had intended to pay it back. Nobody believed her. The city pressed charges, and she was arrested for fraud and misappropriation of funds. The other board members who had been complicit were forced to pay restitution, and the HOA was placed under strict financial oversight. With the corruption exposed, the neighborhood finally had a chance to rebuild. The new board, made up of people who actually cared about the community, focused on transparency and fairness. They eliminated unnecessary fees, refunded improperly charged fines, and made sure that every decision was made with input from the residents. As for me, I had no interest in joining the HOA, but I kept a close eye on things. The neighborhood was changing for the better, and I wasn't going to let anyone drag it back into the mess it had been before. One evening, I was sitting on my porch when Frank walked by. He stopped at the bottom of my steps, a satisfied look on his face. "You did good, kid," he said. I shrugged, just did what needed to be done. Frank chuckled. "Yeah, well, not everyone would have fought back the way you did. This place is better off because of it." I watched as he walked away, feeling a sense of closure. The battle was over, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like home again. Even with the old HOA leadership gone and the worst offenders facing legal consequences, the neighborhood wasn't entirely at peace. The damage they had done over the years had left deep wounds, and not everyone was ready to trust that things would stay fair. Some people were still cautious, waiting to see if the new board would fall into the same traps of power and corruption. Frank and I had spent weeks gathering evidence against the former board, and even though justice had been served, there were still lingering questions. People wanted to know where every last cent of their dues had gone, and some were wondering whether they could get their money back. The city had stepped in to oversee the HOA's financials, but there were still unanswered questions about just how deep the misuse of funds had gone. One afternoon, I found Frank sitting on his front porch, flipping through a thick stack of papers. He looked up when he saw me, motioning for me to come over. He slid a few documents across the table, his expression unreadable. As I scanned them, I realized what I was looking at: previous HOA contracts and payment records that showed just how badly things had been mismanaged, not just with the road nonsense but with everything. They had overcharged for landscaping, maintenance, and even security services that had never been provided. Frank leaned back in his chair, watching me closely. "The city's audit only scratched the surface. There's more." I exhaled, setting the papers down. How much more? Enough that if people knew, they'd be demanding more than just resignations. They'd want their money back. It was one thing to expose corruption and hold people accountable, but getting restitution for the residents was another battle entirely. The HOA had drained the community dry for years, and now that people were seeing the truth, they weren't going to just let it go. As if on cue, a few other neighbors arrived, clearly having heard about what Frank had found. Some of them had been the loudest critics of the old board, but others had been neutral until now. They wanted answers and they wanted action. We spent hours going through the documents, connecting the dots. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became that the corruption had been systemic. The former board had taken advantage of every loophole they could find, and even though the worst offenders were being prosecuted, there were others who had benefited from the scheme and were still walking free. The new HOA board was trying to clean up the mess, but they were overwhelmed. The remaining members weren't corrupt, but they also weren't experienced enough to handle the fallout. That's when an idea struck me. If the HOA had been misusing funds for years, then maybe there was a way to take legal action to recover those losses. not just through criminal charges, but through civil lawsuits. If enough homeowners banded together, we could file a class action lawsuit against the former board members who had profited from the corruption. Frank's eyes lit up when I brought it up. He had spent years dealing with the HOA's nonsense, and now that we had the proof, he wasn't about to let them off the hook. The next step was getting a lawyer involved. My father had already helped expose the fraud, but this was a different fight, one that needed someone with experience in civil litigation. After a few days of searching, we found the right attorney. She specialized in HOA disputes and had taken down corrupt associations before. When we showed her the evidence, she didn't hesitate. She agreed to take the case, and within a week, the lawsuit was officially filed. The news spread fast. The remaining members of the HOA board were caught off guard, but they quickly realized that this wasn't aimed at them, it was aimed at the people who had abused the system for years. And unlike before, when the HOA had used intimidation to silence complaints, this time the entire community was behind it. The lawsuit named every former board member who had been involved in the financial misconduct, including the ex-president, who was already facing criminal charges. It sought restitution for every homeowner who had been overcharged, and it demanded a full accounting of where every dollar had gone. The defendants tried to fight it, claiming they had done nothing wrong, but the evidence was overwhelming. Their bank records showed exactly where the money had gone, and there was no way they could explain away the thousands of dollars that had been funneled into personal accounts. The legal battle dragged on for months, but in the end, the court ruled in our favor. The former board members were ordered to pay back a significant portion of the money they had taken, and the HOA was forced to implement strict financial oversight to prevent anything like this from happening again. For the first time in years, the neighborhood finally felt like it belonged to the residents, not to a power-hungry board looking to exploit them. The HOA still existed, but it had been stripped of its ability to abuse its authority. One evening, as I was walking home, Frank caught up with me. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice filled with something close to pride. "This place is finally what it should have been all along." I nodded, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle in. It had been a long fight, but it was worth it. The HOA had tried to control everything, but in the end, they had been the ones to fall. And justice had finally been served. With the lawsuit settled and the corrupt former board members forced to pay restitution, the neighborhood had finally regained some sense of normalcy. The new HOA board, now composed of people who genuinely wanted to serve the community, focused on transparency and rebuilding trust. But even with the worst of the corruption exposed, the damage left behind was still being felt. Some homeowners were still bitter, understandably so. Years of mismanagement had drained not just their wallets but their patience as well. While most were relieved that justice had been served, a few remained skeptical, waiting for the next power-hungry opportunist to seize control. The once divided neighborhood was slowly healing, but wounds like this didn't close overnight. For Frank and me, things had finally settled into a routine again. The days of battling the HOA's tyranny were over, and life had returned to something resembling normal. But one afternoon, as I was returning from work, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A moving truck sat in front of the house that had once belonged to the former HOA president. The curtains were drawn, and a few unfamiliar men were hauling out furniture. As I stood there watching, Frank strolled up beside me, hands in his pockets. She had lost everything. With the legal fees and restitution payments, she had no choice but to sell her house and leave the neighborhood she had once ruled over with an iron fist. Frank exhaled slowly, watching the movers load a couch into the truck. People were passing by without acknowledging the spectacle, a silent but clear statement that no one was mourning her departure. We didn't linger. There was no need to rub salt in the wound. The consequences had spoken for themselves, and dragging it out would have been unnecessary. In the weeks that followed, things continued to improve. The new board started holding open meetings where every resident had a say in decisions. Policies were rewritten to eliminate arbitrary fines, and financial records were made public for the first time in years. The fear that once surrounded the HOA was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. One evening, a community gathering was held at the park, a far cry from the tense, mandatory HOA meetings of the past. People brought food, kids played, and for the first time in a long while, neighbors actually seemed to enjoy each other's company. Frank and I sat near one of the picnic tables, watching as the new board members spoke with residents. Their approach was different, humble, open to feedback, and clearly uninterested in wielding power for the sake of control. A woman approached us, one of the homeowners who had initially been wary of our fight against the old HOA. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. She admitted that at first she had believed what the former board had said about me stirring up trouble, but after seeing how things had played out, she realized how wrong they had been. The lies, the intimidation, the financial corruption, it had all been designed to keep people compliant. She wasn't the only one. Over the course of the evening, a few more residents approached with similar sentiments. Some apologized for doubting us. Others simply thanked us for standing up when no one else had. Frank took it all in stride. He had never fought this battle for recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. As the gathering wound down, I looked around at the neighborhood, the people laughing, the kids running around without a care in the world. The contrast from where we had been just months ago was staggering. The HOA, once feared and despised, was now just another part of the community. No longer a dictatorship, no longer an unchecked force of control. As Frank and I left, he looked over at me with an approving nod. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, but the look in his eyes said everything. We had won, and this time there was no one left to take that victory away.